This Roman soldier is walking into a trap. The place is Germania. It's 9 AD. Thousands of warriors, fueled by vengeance, are about to strike. The Romans are in for the fight of their lives, facing treacherous terrain, guerrilla tactics, and the unfathomable fury of a cyclonic storm. They risk total annihilation. This is the story of the Lost Legions, one of history's perfect storms. Northern Germany, a land of primeval forests and seemingly untamed wilderness. 2,000 years ago, 3 Roman legions, 16,000 men, marched into these dark forests and were never seen again. Roman historian Cassius Dio speaks of a bloody massacre in the thick of a storm, an epic disaster that changed the course of history. For centuries afterwards, no traces of human remains were found. The fate of the Roman soldiers seemed forever lost to the forest. Then, in 1989, came the discovery of skulls and bones that brought the haunting tale of the Lost Legions back to life.
So it must be from sword, because it's a long wound and a long cut here, and it's very sharp.
This discovery launched a quest to answer one of antiquity's enduring mysteries. How did the greatest army in the world suffer such a catastrophic defeat?
The Roman army is the best organized, the most disciplined, and the most highly trained army in the ancient world. And at its heart is the legionary soldier. He's a volunteer, professional, citizen soldier, bristling with weapons. He's got his pillar, his throwing javelin. He's got his palisading stake for building the marching camp every night. He's got his dalabra. It's an axe for cutting your way through the undergrowth.
Alone, this soldier may not look like much, but multiply him by 4,800 and you have a Roman legion, a superbly disciplined killing machine. It was the key to the success of the Roman Empire, a superpower that dominated the ancient world. In 9 AD, the empire is establishing a new province on its northernmost edge. The Roman emperor has sent a hardened general, Publius Quinctilius Varus, to wield imperial authority.
At the time, Germania was the border between civilization and barbarism. It was the edge of the world.
This was one of the most daunting environments in the empire. A volatile landscape of bogs and forests, often subjected to violent weather.
For the Romans, forests were places of fear and loathing. They very unwillingly went into them. If you see a lot of the early myths, forests are bad places where bad things happen.
They were inhabited by what the Romans called barbarians. Robust warriors and farmers, living in scattered tribes under the leadership of local chieftains.
Varus has got around 16,000 men with him. It's about 10% of the standing Roman army at the time. He's got 3 legions. He's got the 17th, 18th, and 19th.
Among the men is Marcus Ius, an elite legionary soldier. legions are here to ensure a smooth transition from Germanic borderlands to Roman province.
What the Romans really liked was the local aristocracies to join the Roman culture club. Some of these local kings and aristocrats were friendly, others were, on the face of it, friendly, but secretly opposed to the Romans.
One of the largest tribes allied to Rome was the Cherusci.
They made up contracts, peace contracts, which gave the Romans the security that they had a partner in the heart of Germania, to make sure that every partner sticks to this idea of the peace contract. The Cherusci gave their children to education purposes to the Romans.
These young wards of the empire were groomed to be armed allies and faithful servants of their new motherland, Rome. But as one man would prove, this system could go badly wrong. His original Germanic name is lost to history, but ancient Roman writers call him Arminius. Taken from Germania as a boy, he was trained and fought alongside the Roman legions. By the time he returns to his homeland, he is an honored Roman citizen. On the surface, Arminius appears to be the ideal local ally for General Varus, but appearances can be deceiving.
He has seen how Romans slaughtered people, how they burned villages, cities, just because they thought they have the right to do it, because they are Romans.
No empires in history that exploit peoples and annex their lands are particularly fluffy and nice. They all involve a degree of coercion. Roman governors and Roman armies could be ruthless.
Arminius has been both a witness and a victim of this imperial ruthlessness. It has shaped his entire existence. Varus's army is on the move. As summer draws to a close, Marcus and his fellow soldiers are embarking on a march 100 miles west through the dense forest to their winter forts. Arminius will accompany them. He knows these forests intimately. Just before they leave, a rumor ripples through the legions. Arminius is not to be trusted.
An awful lot of military doctrine that is produced today talks about human terrain. And what that means is understanding what are the tribes, what are their affiliations, what are the religious loyalties in this area, understanding precisely where people's loyalties will naturally fall.
Behind Varus's back, Arminius is secretly amassing the largest tribal confederacy ever known. Thousands of barbarian freedom fighters. He intends to hit Rome at the heart of its power, its legions. But Varus does not believe Arminius capable of such deception. He disregards any warning.
I think that Varus fundamentally didn't comprehend the situation he was in at any level. He entirely misunderstood the politics. He thought he was dealing with a compliant population that was pretty much happy to be pushed around in whatever direction he wanted to take them. Maybe that was his first mistake.
In September 9 AD, 3 Roman legions are on the northernmost fringe of the Roman Empire. They don't know it, but they are walking into a trap. Their local ally, Arminius, secretly plans to smash the Romans out of his homeland, Germania, but it will be no easy feat. The Roman legions are a war machine on the open battlefield. Their deployment awesome. Their formations impenetrable. Arminius knows that against a battle-ready Roman army, his rebel force stands little chance.
To attack formed infantry is very, very difficult. If this were a Roman century, there would be on the battlefield in a block, 8 wide and 10 deep. It's got tremendous depth, and don't forget it would be bristling like a porcupine with the pillar stuck up to repel horses. So if I try and get through that, what you'll find happens is I can punch through the front line. If I've got a brave enough horse, we'll get through the front line, but we gradually slow. We're fighting men as we go, and we get in here and we jab and stab our way through, but eventually we stall. We get surrounded and we get hauled off, the horse gets killed, and the game is over. If, of course, we're attacking people in line of march, it's a completely different story.
This simple reality of war has transcended the centuries.
An army on the move is always likely to be vulnerable. A fairly recent example was the retreat of the Iraqi army from Kuwait at the end of the first Gulf War. If you remember those devastating pictures that appeared at the time, that typically is what can happen to an army which is moving and unable to conduct any form of mobile defense.
In 9 AD, Roman engineers felled trees and bridged swamps, but the path they beat is narrow. The legions are forced to march in an exceptionally thin column, strung out over 6 miles.
This isn't just 16,000 soldiers moving from one end of Germany to the other for the winter. The entire families are moving. You've got women, you've got children, you've got slaves, you've got baggage trains. You've got everything from soldiers' dinner gear to heavy artillery.
General Varus assumes that he has at least 6 weeks to get his army to their forts before winter sets in. But Varus doesn't know that a cyclonic storm is gathering over the western Atlantic. As it sucks energy from the ocean, it builds, accelerating east on a course straight towards northwestern Germany.
Three days into the march, the Romans are in the thick of the forest, and they're still 100 kilometers away from their winter forts.
Arminius knows these forests well, and has picked the perfect place to turn on the Roman legions. He puts his plan into motion.
Arminius tells Varus he's been alerted to an uprising in the north. Varus decides to deal with it in person and diverts his entire army. This fateful decision is one of those turning points in history.
Playing into Arminius's hands, Varus heads north, towards the area known as Calcresa. Arminius rides ahead promising to scout, but his real plan is to assume command of the rebel force waiting nearby. After he leaves, a furious storm sets in.
A violent storm is a very, very loud event. Wind is a very unsettling element, and it will have masked them hearing anything.
Communication breaks down, and units become isolated. Arminius uses the storm to his advantage. His men stalk the struggling Romans. For the Romans, bad weather can be a terrible omen, a sign that the gods are angry. Arminius, on the other hand, sees the storm as a gift from his warrior god of thunder, Thor. It is the perfect moment for him to launch his first attack. The warriors take the Romans completely by surprise. Many don't even have time to take their weapons out of their packs.
The fighting style of the Germanic warriors was so completely different to what Roman soldiers were used to. Germanic people had no army. The whole weaponry was so different. The Roman soldiers, they were really in metal from feet to head, and they had these really strong weapons, while Germanic warriors, they just had a small wooden shield, and then they had a lance, and some of them had a sword, and that's it. They even didn't have a helmet.
Free from heavy armor, Arminius launches lightning-quick hit-and-run attacks, similar to the tactics used by guerrilla warriors today.
Never make yourself obvious as a formed body. The minute you look like an army, you can be engaged and destroyed as an army. Always fight against the enemy's weaknesses rather than his strengths.
Marcus Ios and his comrades are surrounded and thrown into the eye of a surprise guerrilla attack. 2,000 years later, Captain Alexander Mackenzie was on a routine patrol in Afghanistan when his platoon was attacked in a similar way.
One part of our patrol was surrounded on 4 sides, simultaneously being shot at from all 4 sides. Now, of course, that means that the enemy is also shooting, across each other as well. So tactically it makes no sense. It's the unexpected, and something that I've never knowingly trained for that type of scenario.
Reality is that combat is a realm of very frightened human beings. Through intense training, we can make sure as we can ever be, that a frightened human being will do exactly what they're trained to do. And by virtue of being trained, the fear goes down.
The fighting is fierce, but Arminius has just made an enemy of 16,000 highly trained, grizzled veteran troops. And Varus, with decades of military experience behind him, has no reason to think that he can't get his men out of these skirmishes.
The storm is starting to calm down, and the Roman army makes it out of the forest into a clearing. Varus finally gets a command down the line. The Romans need to set up camp.
As night falls, the Romans dig in and weather the rest of the storm. The enemy melts back into the forest. But this battle is not over. Arminius knows Varus so well that he has already anticipated his next move. It is 9 AD. 3 Roman legions have weathered a great storm and survived surprise attacks by hostile Germanic forces. Arminius' betrayal has left the Romans unnerved but intact. The skies have cleared, and the enemy is nowhere to be seen. That's because they are planning their next move. Just west of where the Romans are camped is a long, narrow pass cut off on either side by a densely forested hill and a bog that stretches for 25 miles.
Of course, the landscape's changed a vast amount in the last 2,000 years, but you do get a sense of it here. The archaeologists at Calcresa have dug down to the original level and fenced it off. What we've got from here going that way is marshland. As you can see, I'm standing here in the mud and it's already sinking up to my ankles.
In 9 AD, the bog engulfs much of the pass, and the storm has caused flooding. The only dry ground is a rough sandbank. This is the route that Varus will take. However, he'll be walking into a deadly trap. Brilliantly anticipating Varus's moves and exploiting the natural terrain, Arminius has converted this narrow pass into a killing zone.
In 1990, archaeologists discovered these turf ramparts behind me, lining this side of the battlefield. At first they thought they were Roman defensive positions, but then they realized they'd been built by the Germans.
It is a formidable piece of engineering, 1,300 feet long and 6 feet high. The rampart is built of earth and sand. On top, Arminius has placed a wooden palisade.
Arminius had learned the lessons of Rome very, very well. This was one of his masterstrokes.
Totally camouflaged from the path below, the rampart will funnel the Romans into the narrowest part of the pass and provide a defensive wall from which the Germanic warriors can launch a surprise attack. Archaeologists are still uncovering objects relating to the final days of the legionary soldiers. So far, more than 5,000 artifacts have been found.
The bell is one of the most exciting finds. It was full of grass. The legionary who'd been looking after the mule had clearly grabbed a handful of what was around him and pushed it in to stop the bell ringing.
Reeling from the previous day's attacks, the Romans have good reason to silence their mules.
German tribes had a huge reputation for brutality, that when they took captives, they didn't spare them, they didn't give any quarter or mercy. So as they marched out of camp on the day after the skirmishes, they knew that they were now in hostile territory. They knew they could be attacked again at any moment. They were bidden to be silent, I believe, because they were listening out for that attack.
The human response to some of the stresses of that environment, can be quite extreme to the extent that people are physically sick. When you know what could happen, you've seen the consequences, and the negative consequences are very tangible because you've seen the impact of it, then that's the hard thing. And I think that's the thing which, through the generations, all soldiers experience as a uniform.
Marcus and his fellow soldiers move quickly. General Varus has taken a gamble. Stealth and speed are the orders of the day. Following the previous day's attacks, the baggage train has been abandoned. Little does Varus know that by doing this, he's playing into Arminius' master plan. Once the pass is bottlenecked with soldiers, Arminius unleashes a volley of spears. Black in the air. This is Arminius' great revenge. He means for no Roman to leave this pass alive. Marcus Ius finds himself in the middle of a brutal ambush.
One of the physical consequences of being in combat is you have a very heightened sort of sense of awareness, alertness. You may find that it does feel like time slows down and you have this sort of incredible sense of control over things.
We are the same biological organism today that we were 2,000 years ago, that we were 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. There's a universal theme that cuts throughout the history of warfare. A human being is trying to steal your life away. You are in survival mode. In this fear-induced battle, a cascading set of psychological and physiological responses happen. One of the most powerful things is visual distortions and tunnel vision. It's a shutdown of peripheral vision. Some people report it's like looking through a toilet paper tube. Others say it's like looking through a soda straw. It could be that there's loss of blood going to the eye. It could be actually happening inside the brain. The overriding factor of everything that happens in battle is the constant attempt to transcend these limitations. And the one tool that does it is training. Drill, drill, drill on a specific action until that action becomes almost hardwired in.
The Romans have the advantage of elite training, numerical superiority, and advanced weaponry. But knowing his enemy very well, Arminius has handpicked a battlefield that renders many of the large Roman battle formations useless.
Throughout history, whenever one side has been unable to create any sort of parity on the battlefield, then the natural thing to do is to try and create an asymmetric relationship within the engagement. So fight them where the numbers have least effect. And typically, that's going to be in a constrained space.
The Romans are pinned to the narrow passage. If they go north, they will drown in the Great Bog. The rampart blocks the southern route over the forested hill. But Mike Lodes believes that there is something that could have tipped the balance in favor of the Romans here in the pass.
This is a catapulta. It's a piece of Roman field artillery, very mobile. They would have about 60 of these per legion. So these were used a great deal in battlefield situations and would be very good in siege situations or in assailing ramparts.
It's operating on a torsion principle.
So let's ratchet this back. It comes really quite quickly. You can see it's coming, locking in there. You start to feel the power and you start to hear the power. I mean, that creak and squeak is really quite terrifying. You like to put the bolt in and take the pin out. Now, I can aim it. I think it's probably something around about there. Look at that, smash straight through. If Arminius had been facing this kind of barrage, he really would have been pinned down, because not only are we punching through those hurdles very easily with these bolts, we can elevate it and aim over the top, so his men would be pushed way back from those ramparts.
But the catapults never made it to the battlefield. When Varus abandoned the baggage train early that morning, he also left the heavy artillery, burning hundreds of catapults to the ground. Marcus and his men are forced to fight their enemy and the terrain with just the weapons they carry on their backs. But in the flash of an eye, everything will change. For 2 days, 3 Roman legions have been locked in a life and death struggle with thousands of enraged Germanic warriors. The Romans have training and technology on their side. The Germans have the home turf advantage, but a new factor is about to come into play. ancient historian Cassius Dio tells of another fierce storm that shrieks through the pass, wreaking havoc.
Well, the storm that probably hit the Romans was what's called a frontal storm. They're sometimes called extratropical cyclones.
Originating in the western Atlantic, the storm gathers energy and power as it blows across the ocean. It's hundreds of miles wide and barrels into northwestern Germania with full force.
The amount of energy that's involved is huge because it covers such a wide area. You're talking about at least 10 hydrogen bombs.
The storm has disastrous effects on the battle raging below, limiting the Romans' ability to use their weapons. Mike has never tried using Roman weapons in high winds before. This machine can generate gale force winds at 100 miles per hour.
It was quite intense and quite surprising as well. The thing that I'm suffering from most is my fingertips are numb, like I've been in an ice storm. And it's when wind is that fast, even though it's a reasonably mild day today, but it has made me cold to the bone. So your grip starts to go on the sword and all of that sort of thing after a few minutes.
The thick storm clouds throw the clashing forces into darkness and release torrents of rain.
Roman infantry in the legions had large curving body shields, which were as much weapons, in a sense, as their swords. And these were made of a form of glued plywood, which must have soaked up continuous rainfall like gigantic sponges and become extremely heavy and unwieldy.
The German tribesmen are less affected by the weather.
One of the Roman historians say that the Germans fought naked. Of course they didn't. What he meant is that they fought lightly armed. That was perfect for this kind of terrain, for this kind of weather. It meant Arminius could get in, hit the Romans, and then get away again before they knew what had hit them.
There are clues on the battlefield suggesting that Arminius was expecting bad weather. He built drainage ditches behind the ramparts. John believes that accustomed to the local weather patterns, Arminius could have known the storm was coming days ahead of time.
The most obvious sign is these things called cirrus clouds, which are mare's tails. They're icy clouds that form wispy tails very high up in the atmosphere.
The drainage ditch is really, really efficiently designed. Not only does it take the water away from the Germans to make sure that the ramparts aren't undermined, it takes it towards the Romans, so their muddy land is getting even muddier.
In 1989, archaeologists found human remains beside the remnants of Arminius' rampart.
We found not a skeleton, we found not an individual, we found only isolated bones. The soil there is not very good for the preservation for bones. And you can see it here very well that these were a complete skull, and you found only the enamel of the individuals.
Birgit has found remains of 17 individuals. The wounds are a gruesome snapshot of what happened that day.
When it was done by an axe, it must be an axe with a long blade, because it's a big injury.
The pass has been transformed by the weather. The entire area has become a treacherous quagmire, unfit for any battle. The Romans are gradually losing their ability to fight their way out of this nightmare. There's no time to lose. General Varus must devise a plan to reverse their fortunes or risk annihilation. Meanwhile, Roman soldier Marcus Aetus is battling 3 enemies at once. Furious Germanic warriors, hostile terrain, and a brutal cyclonic storm. In 2007, a similarly violent storm hit Germany, with hurricane-force winds reaching over 125 miles per hour. It had a devastating effect on the nation's forests, damaging 40 million trees. In those same forests, 2,000 years earlier, the Romans are in the fight of their lives in horrific weather.
We're talking about violent storms, more than gale force winds, thunder, like cataclysmic, end-of-the-world dramatic weather.
You get thunder and lightning, of course, and lightning is attracted to trees, so certain trees nearby would have been exploding.
And we're talking about pre-Christian Romans who believe in different gods for different elements.
The German tribes are used to such violent weather, but the storm plays on the psychology of the superstitious Romans.
Napoleon said, in war, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. That is, the psychological factors in battle are 3 times more important than the physical factors. Throughout history, the battlefield has been a realm of creatures roaring at each other. And the rebel yell, just such an awesome weapon for psychological dynamics on the battlefield.
As reports of the raging battle spread through northern Germania, local warriors flocked to join Arminius' cause. His force swells to more than 25,000 men, outnumbering the struggling Romans. Arminius' new recruits are well-rested and hungry for a fight. By contrast, the Romans have been on the defense for 3 days.
24 hours without sleep is equivalent to legally drunk. A fresh warrior and a completely exhausted warrior are 2 physiological different human beings. It's a difference between a fully charged battery and an empty battery. Without having a reserve to throw into the battle at the key moment, there is no hope, and there's nothing but that total collapse, like a house of cards falling in itself.
Roman General Varus has no reserves, and the combination of factors working against them take their toll.
I think the weather has done a lot to limit the diversity of troops they have, to not have all the equipment with them that they needed, like artillery. But I think the thing that decided it was they must have simply lost hope.
People need hope in life, in any circumstance, and if you don't feel like there's going to be an end, if it feels like it's relentless, then it's not only physically debilitating, but psychologically debilitating as well.
Varus knows that he's reached the end of the line. He knows that he's never going to make it back to civilization in one piece. The battlefield behind me is littered with dead and dying Romans. And Varus doesn't want to fall into the hands of the Germans. So he takes the unimaginable decision. He decides to kill himself.
Once that top layer of command is removed, then the bonds which allow these armies to coordinate, to reinforce, to act in a way that's tactically much more effective than masses of warriors is also removed.
Arminius' men decapitate Varus's body in triumph. As the battle winds down, anyone who isn't dead or dying in the streams of mud and blood is taken prisoner. Experts believe nearly all of the 16,000 Roman legions were killed in the battle. As for those who survived, the nightmare has just begun. The battle is over. The Romans are defeated, but for the prisoners of war, the horrors are just beginning.
The Germans believed in blood sacrifice. The senior Roman officers would have been tortured, then they would have been burned alive. The legionaries had their eyes gouged out, then they were hanged, and then they were nailed to trees.
It's thought only a handful of Romans lived to tell the tale of the battle. The oldest account, believed based on eyewitness reports, appeared 20 years after the disaster. As for the ancient relics of those who fell, Germanic plundering of the battlefield was so thorough that only fragments remain for archaeologists to discover.
A piece of armor was found on the battlefield, engraved Marcus Aius, first cohort, clearly a crack legionary. And it's pieces like that which give us an intimate insight to what happened all those centuries ago.
After sacrifices and plundering, the victorious Germanic tribes dedicated the battlefield to their warrior god, Thor. But Arminius was the mortal victor. He achieved the unachievable. He brought down the greatest army in the world.
The point that Arminius is trained in the Roman army, I think, is very crucial for the understanding of the whole Varus battle, because he really learned so much about the Romans. He knew their strength, he knew the weaknesses.
I think we can ascribe Arminius' victory to a number of factors in combination. We have the generic incompetence of Varus and his loss of the plot at a key point in the proceedings. We have the weather, abominable all the way through. We have the topography which the Germans knew and could use to their greatest advantage. And overall, we had a professional, veteran army that, like any other army, it could become exhausted, demoralized, and start to fall apart.
This is an example of an indigenous, ill-formed, undisciplined force defeating the army of a superpower. We're looking at an imperial power at the very zenith of its abilities, and all of a sudden it has a catastrophic defeat.
The news of the disaster takes 10 days to reach the Emperor Augustus in Rome. He's lost more than 10% of his entire army.
Augustus seems to have become a little bit unhinged and shouted things like, "Varus, where are my legions? Give me back my legions."
Arminius escapes Roman vengeance, but 12 years after the battle, he's assassinated by a member of his own tribe. Once again, the Germanic tribes disperse. They would not reunite for almost 200 years.
Few battles stop an empire on its track, and that's exactly what Arminius did. The Roman frontier now became the Rhine. It became the barrier between civilization and barbarism, and it was one that was only rarely crossed.
This barrier created by Arminius endured over time to shape a continent and impact the world.
Some historians say that if Varus had won and Germany had been Romanized, then there would have been one dominant culture in Europe and not two. That would have meant no Charlemagne, no Napoleon, and no Hitler. History would have been very different.
All empires strive for invincibility, but when human betrayal and ingenuity combine, and the earth and the skies conspire, even the greatest of empires are forced to face their own mortality. And in